Hello everyone and welcome to episode 24 of the History Hotline. Today we will be learning about Mary Seacole. And you might be thinking, oh, actually, she is the one figure in Black history that I actually know about. You know, she is actually on the British national curriculum. So if you went to school in the last, I think, 20 or 25, 30 years, you should have learnt something about Mary Seacole, we hope. This month, the month of March, is actually Women's History Month. Obviously, you know, this is a podcast that specifically looks at Black, British and Caribbean history. So we will be looking at Black, British and Caribbean women during this Women's History Month. But also, you know, women's movements and women's organisations in Britain more widely. I don't like just doing episodes about people, but I think Mary Seacole is such a trailblazer in regards to women and their kind of movement and their roles in, you know, the post-war era that they took up. I think Mary Seacole was such a trailblazer and an icon in that sense. I do believe it's very important we start with her. Apart from that, you know, I want to look at organisations this month. We'll be looking at some other women as well. You know, there'll be content created on Instagram, especially for some of the other prominent women in Black British history and in the Caribbean. And even we might even look at some women in Africa, because I think, you know, women are so neglected, especially Black women. Black women are so neglected when it comes to history, any kind of history. And I did my dissertation for my master's degree looking at Caribbean women specifically in Britain, and Mary Seacole was kind of the starting point of that narrative. And so I just feel like I'm really in my zone this month. Like, I'm going to have a good month. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy this research, I enjoy making these podcasts, but this month I'm in my bag. So be ready for some exceptional and extraordinary Black women that have unfortunately been erased from the narrative. But here we are, writing them back into history. So as I've mentioned, this month is Women's History Month, and I wanted to, I guess, signpost you and alert you to a charity that has been coming up on my timeline on Twitter and my Instagram feed for quite some time now, because they've been having a lot of problems with Hackney Council. And the work that they do, I believe, is so imperative that, you know, they have a GoFundMe at the moment, and I do all this educating for free. You know, some people have very kindly said, you know, please let me compensate you for your labour, because we've learnt so much for free that we would otherwise maybe pay for in a book. But if there's anyone listening that feels that way, I want to signpost you to Sister Space, Sister spelt SISTAH, Sister Space Sanctuary. It's a charity dedicated to supporting African and Caribbean heritage women and girls affected by domestic and sexual abuse. And the charity was established after the murder of a woman called Valerie Ford and her 23-month-old baby RJ, who from Hackney, and the perpetrator was an ex-partner of Valerie and the baby's father. You know, she had reported the threats made to her and her son, and, you know, it was kind of in vain because she was killed anyway. Black women often feel unable to report abuse for many reasons, due to not being believed, due to fears of what will happen to a Black man in police custody. Black women tend to bear the burden of that because we know there is institutional racism, and as much as a Black woman might want to see justice done or to feel safe, she's also aware that justice might not come from the police. Hackney Council have decided that Sister Space have to return to a shopfront building in an unsafe area, and this is a space that is currently serving the community, it's serving Black women, and it's under threat. You know, fundraising for charities has been at an all-time low due to the pandemic, and Sister Space have been one of those charities that have been affected. They have created a GoFundMe, and most of the information I just read out was actually from their GoFundMe introduction. I will put the link for that in my bio. I'll put it in the show notes, my bio on Instagram and Twitter show notes. I'll tweet about it and retweet some of their pleas for funding and for money. they really do need this money, and you know, people have been donating so much. I think they're at about 116,000. They're trying to reach 150,000, but I just really thought it was important that this month, you know, for Women's History Month, that we illuminate these charities that are doing the work and struggling to do so. You know, I have a platform now that, you know, quite a few people are tuning in. Thank you all. So yeah, if you do have spare coins, you know, you've saved a bit on your commute whilst we've been in lockdown or anything of that nature, please do donate if you can, or do some more research, or just tweet about them, raise awareness, because they are being pushed out. I believe it's all kind of linked into gentrification, especially it being in Hackney and that area, but it's something that definitely needs to be addressed. So yeah, do some research about them, and if you feel comfortable, please do donate. Thank you. And now for our episode. So as I said, we'll be talking about Mary Seacole, born Mary Jane Grant on the 23rd of November 1805 in Jamaica, and she died on the 14th of May 1881. So she was a British-Jamaican nurse, healer and businesswoman, and I say British-Jamaican because her father was British and her mother was Jamaican, and she was born in 1805, which was a time where black people in Jamaica were enslaved for the most part, but there was a class of free black people and mixed race people who would be known as mulattoes. And so she came from the traditions of Jamaican and West African doctresses, and her mom was of that tradition. Her mom would heal people using tropical and herbal remedies in Jamaica, and she passed on these skills to Mary Seacole, who then, you know, decided that her calling in life was to help British soldiers, despite, you know, how far the conflicts and battlefields would be. And she ended up helping in the Crimean War in 1853 in Russia. She was on the front lines as a healer and a doctress and a nurse. She didn't have like formal British nursing qualifications or training, but you know, we're talking about the 1800s here. She was trained in using herbal remedies and tropical remedies to fight diseases that would have been quite common in the soldiers she would have been faced with in the front lines of the Crimean War. So just to give some context into the role of a doctress in Jamaica, you know, we are talking about the 1800s, so we are talking about a time where there is slavery, there are essentially slave masters, planters, plantation owners on the island, as well as enslaved people and free people. And the role of this kind of doctress figure was a mixture of a nurse, a midwife, kind of masseuse, a herbalist, drawing on traditions of Creole medicine, and those traditions would have come from West Africa as the enslaved people were kidnapped and taken. So these women were doing the role of a nurse essentially before it's called that, and before they are professionally and trained officially to do that. They would have also nursed and cared for the plantation owners as well as the enslaved people, if that was the case. There are other famous doctresses, Jamaican doctresses, in the 18th century Jamaica, alongside Mrs. Grant, who is Mary Seacole's mother, Cuba Cornwallis, Sarah Adams, Grace Dawn. They cared for one of Jamaica's wealthiest planters, a man called Simon Taylor. And they also were in the habit of good hygiene, which you might be thinking, of course, you know, they're healers. They're doctresses, of course they have to know about hygiene, but hygiene wasn't common knowledge. The way germs spread, it wasn't known. You know, there was a point in history where people believed that germs were spreading just through the air. They believed in something called miasma, where the seeds of disease would float through the air. If anyone has done medicine through time as their GCSE topic in history, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Medicine has developed so vastly and so quickly over certain periods of time. In the 18th and 19th century in Jamaica, the use of kind of hygiene and good hygiene practices would have not necessarily been common. It wouldn't have been common in Britain. It wouldn't have been common in many parts of the world, but the practice of good hygiene, you know, a century before Florence Nightingale even pens notes on nursing, which is what she's known for, this is what they were doing in Jamaica. So Mary Seacole is able to learn these things. You know, she's coming from a very strong tradition and a very integrated tradition within Jamaican society, and she is able to learn from her mother and from the women around her, and begin experimenting in medicine, in tropical remedies, in herbal remedies. And firstly, she actually worked on dolls to administer her medicine and experiment. She progressed to pets, and then started helping her mother treat obviously humans. And her family had close ties with the army because her dad, he was a Scottish lieutenant in the British Army, so they had links with the military, and so she was able to have access to soldiers essentially. And combining that knowledge with the work she'd done with her mother, she was able to, I think, be very comfortable around soldiers. I think that's where she felt her calling lie. She was always drawn to helping those that were fighting for Britain. So, as we've said, Mary Seacole's passion for medicine, helping others, developed at a young age. You know, she's following in her mother's footsteps. Her mother has a boarding house called Blundell Hall. And, you know, during this time, this is where Mary was observing everything and honing in her skills and her interests. So she worked and lived in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean area from 1826 to about 1851. And during this time, she actually took over Blundell Hall when her mother unfortunately passed away. She treated patients in the cholera epidemic of 1850, which actually killed around 32,000 Jamaicans. During this time, she gained vital information about contagion theory and how diseases spread. Obviously, you know, not to the scientific degree or level that could be done in a lab, but on grassroots, on the ground, we need to treat the people that are ill right now. She learnt a lot. So in 1851, she travelled to Panama, and I'm sorry, it seems like I'm rushing through, but we're going to get to the actual part of her life that she's kind of known for, and I do really want to think about her legacy as well, because there's a reason why Mary Seacole's on the curriculum and other black women aren't, and there's a reason why she's one of the only statues in Britain of a black woman. I think there's only about 3 or 4 statues of black women in Britain. Mary Seacole is one of them, and there is a reason. So 1851, she travels to Panama to visit her brother. Panama's then struck by cholera, and so she gets involved in treating and curing victims, and her reputation as a nurse and a healer, it really, really grows and it soars. Mary reads of the Crimean War, which started in 1853, and it's a war between Russia and Britain. Remember, at the time, Britain is definitely in charge of Jamaica and many Caribbean islands, definitely being referred to as the mother country, and the kind of colonial link is very strong at that time. You know, we're not even stepping anywhere near the 1900s yet, so we're talking about slavery is still a thing. And so Mary Seacole is in Panama, reading about this Crimean War, and in 1854 she actually travels from Panama to England so she could join the second contingent of nurses to the Crimea. She applies officially through the War Office and other government offices, but was repeatedly refused. Can anybody guess why? I'll give you 3, 2, 1. Yep, because of her race. She speaks about it in her autobiography, actually. She has an autobiography called The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands. And I want to get into why we won't talk about that yet. You don't know what I was thinking, but we won't talk about it yet. What I will say is, in this autobiography, which I've read, it's wonderful, she speaks about this lazy Creole ideology and that she is trying to subvert and challenge in her own life. A Creole, for her, being someone that's mixed race, she would have been legally identified as a mulatto or a quadroon, due to her percentage mix of black and white in that society at that time. She was referred to by some as a yellow lady, probably due to her complexion, and she was very aware of the stereotypes and her place in society as a mixed race woman. just because, she wasn't fully black, her place was nowhere near the top of the kind of social hierarchy or racial hierarchy. It wouldn't have been in the same place as someone that would have been fully black at the time. They would have probably been enslaved and she was free. But regardless, there are still stereotypes attached to her, not only as a black person and as a Creole, shall we say, but as a woman as well. Her place wasn't necessarily to be on a front line, but she found herself on a front line. And we'll get to how soon. So this is also a similar time where Florence Nightingale is doing her thing in Britain, just for context and just for kind of a little comparison if you're thinking about that. So she applies to the War Office, government offices. She's repeatedly refused. This is Mary Seacole's calling, She believes that God has told her she is to be on that front line helping these soldiers. So she is going by any means necessary. I'm telling you that now. And when you read the autobiography, if you ever get around to it, it's so clear that she just believes that it's her purpose, it's her calling, it's her destiny to do this work for people. So Mary Seacole, they're not flying her out, they're not getting her to England. They're not getting her to the Crimea. And so she decides she's going to get there by all means necessary, She's a businesswoman, as I've said. She's run Blundell House in the past when her mother's passed away. She also has money, which is a very, very key and important thing to think about. She uses her own resources, essentially. She pays for the ability to go to the Crimea. She gets there. She arranges for business cards to be sent, announcing the opening of her British hotel, as she called it. She described it as a mess table and comfortable quarters for sick and convalescent officers. The British Hotel was completed in July 1855, as in it was built, in the Crimea. I think it was a region called Scutari. And it had a main room, kitchen, sleeping huts, outhouses, stable yard. And then she also got provisions from London and Constantinople, which, she personally sold to soldiers. So not just medical provisions, but also things like alcohol, kind of creature comforts that soldiers would be missing at home. Because I think she realised that in healing people, it wasn't necessarily always about the medicine. It was sometimes about the kind of mental side of it. If you're a soldier fighting far away from home, sometimes the thing that might have you feeling better or being better mentally could just be something that reminds you of home. And so that was different kinds of foods, drinks that she brought in from London. So that, they would feel better in that sense, not necessarily medically. I mean, if someone has like a broken leg, a glass of gin's not really going to help them. However, in the moment they might feel slightly better. But she was very aware of all these things. So you might be thinking, well, why did Mary Seacole just decide to go straight to the front line? Like, who told her she could build a British hotel and just, scurry over to the front lines? Well, I'll tell you how she got there. Mary Seacole is determined to help these soldiers and get to the Crimea. So Florence Nightingale has set up a hospital in Scutari, and Mary Seacole gets there and, says, well, can I work with your group of nurses to treat the soldiers? And she's rejected. Now, again, it's not explicitly said that it was Florence Nightingale going, it's because you're black, but I don't know. I can't really assume anything else. Forgive me if I am being overzealous, but I would definitely say that it's probably because she's black. Not necessarily because, she didn't want to work with a black person, although this was implied. I would say that these stereotypes that Mrs. Seacole in her autobiography is so familiar with, this idea of the lazy Creole, these stereotypes are all negative about black people, what they can do, what they are able to do, and what they are willing to do. I think those stereotypes are very pervasive, and they are the reason why Mary Seacole is rejected. And also, obviously, tying into the fact that they maybe didn't want to work with a black person. They didn't know what that would be like, and they had their prejudices and their discrimination. But Mary Seacole was not to be... She didn't take no very well. In fact, she doesn't take no at all. No, it doesn't mean anything to her, I don't think. why she's one of the many inspirations in my life, because she really just does not take no for an answer. So, as I've said, you know, she sets up the British Hotel. She sets it up, and I'm going to tell you where she sets it up. 4 miles from the front line. 4 miles is not far when it comes to battles, front lines, bombs, guns, bang, 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 explosions. 4 miles, right? So she's getting these soldiers. They've been shot 4 miles away, and they're getting to her straight away, or not necessarily shot, but wounded, injured, hurt. It's insane to me that she sets it up that close. There's stories actually from other soldiers and officers, as well as in her autobiography, of her literally having to duck and dive from bombs and explosions, like explosions going over her head and she just having to drop to the ground. And she was quite a big lady, and soldiers have commented on that, like it was not amusing to see her going up and down, dropping to the floor, because obviously it's very serious and it's a war zone. But, you know, it was also quite a sight, they've said, quite a wondrous sight, because nobody asked Mary Seacole to be there. Mary Seacole believed it was her destiny and her portion in life to help these soldiers. And I'll tell you what really cemented her influence and her impact on these men that were healed by her. She healed so many men. It's ridiculous to me that a woman who funded this whole expedition herself was rejected by so many official people and people that are so widely recognised and heralded today, like our good old Florence Nightingale with her Nightingale hospitals in this pandemic. That was one thing, you know, when all these hospitals were being named Nightingale, I thought, oh, I wonder if there'll be a Seacole hospital. And I wasn't surprised that there wasn't, but it just, it struck a chord, I would say. There's also a horrible history sketch of the little beef between Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale. It's actually been contested by historians and also those people that are interested in the heritage/legacy of Florence Nightingale, because it's said to be quite an inaccurate sketch. So I would take all this information with a pinch of salt when it comes to that little disagreement or conversation that could have occurred between Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole. However, as you can probably imagine, my mind is made up about what I think happened. I wasn't there, but I can infer. I would like to say that Mary Seacole was one of the women I initially wanted to do my dissertation on for my master's. So I have actual paragraphs of work that I've written that were going to be the start of my dissertation, in fact. And they didn't make it, actually. They didn't make the cut. So here they are, for one night only. I'm going to read them out because these speak on her legacy, and they speak on how she was forgotten in history. And she really was. There's a reason you're learning about her today, and we're going to get there shortly. But if you haven't guessed, it has something to do with the fact that she wrote a book about herself. Because it seems to be the case that in history, if a black woman wants to be remembered, she has to write about herself. When you think about it, the two other women that I've done podcast episodes on, Fanny Eaton and Beryl Gilroy. Beryl Gilroy wrote an autobiography, and Fanny Eaton was a subject of art. She was literally drawn into history by those people that were, you know, in the pre-Raphaelite movement. So you can see my point with this idea of erasing black women from history, because for the most part, they're there because they have written themselves in, or in the case of Fanny Eaton, they've been drawn in. Okay, before that turns into a conversation and a tangent about something that isn't directly relevant to today's episode, I'm going to go into my paragraph that I didn't put in my dissertation and now you get to hear. So, in 1854, British-Jamaican Mary Seacole travelled from her native Jamaica to Britain to volunteer as a nurse during the Crimean War. Despite facing rejection from a hospital nurse role, a failed appeal to the War Office, and a dismissal from Florence Nightingale at a hospital in Scituate, she headed to the front line in Crimea. Mother Seacole, as she was known, set up the British Hotel 4 miles from the front line and healed many soldiers through her experiences in medicine and healing. How could England forget a woman who made it her personal mission to travel across the world and heal sick and wounded soldiers on the front line during active conflict? Seacole, referred to as a coloured or a black woman, navigating British society and subverting ideas relating to gender and race. The lazy Creole ideology perpetuated by British society was challenged by Mary Seacole's desire to serve British soldiers despite the lack of support she was initially given. She overcame the barrier set up for women that looked like her, but despite her gratuitous service, England did forget the one who nursed her sick, who sought out her wounded to aid and succour them. And that is a quote taken directly from Mary Seacole's autobiography, The Preface, by W.H. Russell, who was a special correspondent of the Times and established his reputation through his independent reporting of the Crimean War. He was one of the most influential journalists at the time, and he also received a knighthood in 1902 and wrote this preface for Mary Seacole because he literally said the words, I trust that England will not forget the one who nursed her sick and sought out her wounded to aid and succour them, and who performed the last offices for some of her illustrious dead. As we know, Britain really do honour those who have died in war and active conflict, and it was no different in 1854 during the Crimean War, and Mary Seacole was honouring them with her work. And so, we might not necessarily think that's what we would do if we were her, but she was completely and utterly adored by those soldiers that she saved and healed and helped. And we'll get on to further evidence of this later. I'm going to finish my paragraph now anyway. Thank you. So, Mary Seacole clearly highlights in her life a sentiment that persisted in regards to coloured women and their potential role in Britain. Mary Seacole is often used as the only black British woman in retelling black women's contribution to Britain. History forgot her, and it wasn't until 1984, through a republication of her autobiography that she published originally in the late 1800s, did she reappear. If she'd not written this autobiography, would her story have been forgotten forever? Mary Seacole is the only named black British woman on the national curriculum. Also, after years of campaigning, is now standing outside of Guy's Hospital, London, in statue form. These campaigns were led by the likes of Connie Marks and Elizabeth Anyonwu at various points of their own lives. And both of these women are black women, and it really does speak to the notion that black women are often solely responsible for the recognition of their lives and the cultural impact of those who share in their identities. My point there was, it seems to be only black women that are remembering black women in history. I mean, case in point right here on the History Hotline. My research so far has been quite centred on black women, and I think that will remain the case in the future because I just feel like this work isn't being done by the mainstream at all. Black history is not being done very well by the mainstream at all, but black women are in serious threat of some kind of historical extinction if things carry on the way they are. And Connie Mark, I think I've mentioned her in past episodes. She was a member of the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, during World War II from Jamaica. She stayed in Jamaica, actually. She was a medical secretary during the war. Elizabeth Anyonwu is a nurse and professor, and she is an incredible woman and has written also an autobiography, funnily enough, Letters from a Cambridge Union. It came out recently. She's also been awarded the Pride of Britain Award very recently too. And she has done a lot of work on campaigning for the recognition of Mary Seacole and also on diseases such as sickle cell, which impact and affect black people disproportionately than white people globally and in this country specifically too. And also she has campaigned to make sure that medical students are actually being taught about what diseases, certain diseases especially to do with the skin and maybe hair, look like on black people, because as we know, black people don't necessarily go red. They might not get a red rash. They don't really go, we don't go blue in the face. But the default for medical standards in this country are tested on white people. And so that can lead to misdiagnoses. And as we know, black women are dying disproportionately in childbirth, and medical racism is a thing. Both of these women have done incredible things, and they have also, through their work, campaigned for the recognition of a fellow black woman who paved the way and came before them. So, as I mentioned, Mary Seacole has written this autobiography. You might be thinking, well, when did she do that then? So, she came back from the Crimean War and she was bankrupt. Like, she has no money because she spent it all on helping these soldiers. And so, some of the soldiers kind of come together and they create this, like, fundraising banquet for her. And it allows her to raise funds to actually, I think she sets up another hospital-type premise in England. Also, to support her fundraising, because she literally has no money, she writes this autobiography to raise money because it's going to be sold. And so I just find that quite an interesting little piece of information to this narrative, because it's not just her maybe arrogantly suggesting that she deserves to be remembered in history. That's not what's happening by any means. You know, this is a financial attempt at securing some funds because she's bankrupt after all the work she's done. But the beautiful thing about this autobiography is she has a section where she includes remarks from the press and from soldiers about what they had to say about her. And again, this autobiography, another beautiful thing about it is the fact that it's not until 1984 that it's kind of rediscovered and republished. And this is where, you know, Britain kind of starts to wake up and remember Mary Seacole. Even though W.H. Russell said England cannot forget her, well, they forgot her. They really did. They forgot this black woman that, you know, travelled halfway across the world to heal their wounded soldiers. I want to read out some of the remarks. Punch's remarks are: that berry brown face with a kind heart's trace impressed on each wrinkle sly was a sight to behold through the snow clouds rolled across that iron sky. So that's kind of, you know, romanticising our Mary in a beautiful way, and suggesting, you know, that her face was kind of warming to those soldiers, you know, kind eyes, and it was a sight to behold in a snowy Crimea. Interestingly, Mary Seacole refers to these tributes coming up and says, "Here are two from one of my best and kindest sons." She referred to them as her sons because they referred to her as Mother Seacole, as their mother, you know, their mother away from home that was to look after them and get them back to full health so that they could return home. So one of them beautifully said, "Having been attacked one evening with a very bad diarrhea at Mrs. Seacole's, took some of her good medicine. It cured me before the next morning and I have never been attacked since." And that was from October 1855. Another one that says, "I certify that Madame Seacole twice cured me effectually of dysentery while in the Crimea, and also my clerk and the men of my corps." One of them says, "Dear Mrs. Seacole, it is with feelings of great pleasure that I hear you are safely arrived in England, upon which I beg to congratulate you and return you many thanks for your kindness whilst in the Crimea. The bitter sherry you kindly made up for me was in truth a great blessing to both myself and my son. As I expect to go to Bombay shortly, I would feel grateful if you would favour me with the receipt for making it, as it appears to be so grateful a beverage for my weakness and bowel complaints in a warm climate. With many kind regards, believe me, dear madam, your obliged servant, Samuel P." And his name is blocked out, his surname beginning with a P, and he was late Superintendent Army Works Corps. So, as you can tell from some of those, you know, you've got soldiers wanting to pay her back for the things she did for them whilst they were in need. And, you know, checking in on her after the whole battle's been done. I've never checked in on a doctor that has ever, you know, helped me out. And I know it's a different time and we don't do things like that anymore. We all have our own GPs that we see all the time, forever ill, God forbid. But I just found the relationship that she had and that she nurtured with those soldiers to be quite an interesting one in the sense of, you know, them being her sons and she being their mother. So that is pretty much everything there is to say. Well, it's not. It's nowhere near everything there is to say about Mary Seacole, but it's all this podcast will be saying about Mary Seacole. And as we've said, it's Women's History Month, and I'm happy to have started with such an incredible and selfless woman. And I hope this has inspired you to read her autobiography maybe, or read some of the work that's been written about her. There is a wealth of information. Because she's on the national curriculum, you can find child level videos from like primary school all the way up in regards to finding out more information about Mary Seacole. Remember, these podcasts are only just an introduction to anyone that we speak about, or any themes really, because there's only so much you can say about someone in like half an hour really. So this is the first episode of our Women's History Month. I hope you enjoyed our Black US times UK crossover history month that was last month, and please follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and tune in on Google Podcasts, Spotify or iTunes, and episodes are also going up. 4 episodes a week on YouTube. There will be back episodes, and we're aiming to get to about April where everything will be already on there, and we can start potentially recording for YouTube in the future, or creating separate content for YouTube that will be as engaging and as educational as this podcast. So thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful week. Goodbye.